What if the bells that crowned the old cities of Europe were never designed to call people to prayer, but to call something else? Or worse, what if they were never meant to call at all, but to awaken something woven into the air itself? We have been taught to think of bells as symbols of faith, ceremony, or celebration, harmless instruments of ritual sound. But buried in forgotten archives and lost exposition halls are fragments of a story that was never meant to be told, a story in which bells behave more like machines, frequencies behave more like power, and history behaves less like memory and more like a carefully orchestrated silence. Imagine standing in Kiev in the autumn of 1896, the wind quiet, the exhibition grounds calm at the end of a long day. Pavilion 4 sits in an unremarkable corner of the complex, its wooden floorboards creaking beneath the boots of restorers, cataloging the last of the crates. Nothing about the wooden box marked acoustic ornaments seems out of place at first, but the label beneath it carries instructions that feel out of proportion to its mundane appearance. Do not strike. Inside the crate, lying among straw and dust, are bronze fragments, curved like the ribs of some metallic creature, each stamped with a serial number and a sigil of overlapping circles. The catalog calls them decorative pieces. And yet, no blueprint, no photograph, no curator's note mentions these pieces ever being installed. They are orphans inside their own history. One restorer, out of curiosity more than carelessness, taps a fragment with the back of a wooden tool. A sound escapes. Low, almost sub-audible at first, then deepening into a humming vibration that rises through the floorboards and shivers the glass cases nearby. The frequency is later measured at exactly 112 hertz. A tone that sits uncomfortably between sound and sensation, more felt in the chest than heard in the ears. The restorers exchange looks, but write nothing unusual in the report. The fragment, still warm from the vibration, is catalogued and sealed away. No explanation is offered for why decorative bronze would respond like a tuning instrument crafted with scientific precision. Across the hall, in a photograph later retouched beyond recognition, a bell hangs above a device that looks suspiciously like a generator, coils, rods, and wires running beneath the raised platform. In the first print, the machinery is unmistakable. In the second, released to the public, the device is painted out entirely, replaced with shadows that make no architectural sense. The museum explains it as a correction, a retouching error. But the dust in the original negative falls in a pattern that suggests magnetic interference, particles aligned in quiet obedience to a field that no one admits was present that day. History remembers progress, the triumph of industrial exhibitions and world fairs, but it often forgets what progress replaced. It forgets the things that did not fit the narrative. The bells of Tartaria, if we can even still use that forbidden word without provoking controversy, were once scattered across cathedrals, towers, and exhibition halls between Paris, St. Petersburg, Chicago, and Kiev. They were shaped like bells, yes. They were cast in bronze, polished until they gleamed under gaslight, suspended proudly for crowds to admire. But underneath that familiarity lay something else, something that kept resurfacing in records that should have aligned but never quite did. Dates contradicted themselves. Shipping logs listed crates a decade before an exhibition even existed. Installation diaries ended abruptly with missing pages. Photographs were retouched, rewritten, replaced. If bells were merely bells, why would their history behave like this? Consider the International Exposition of Paris in 1873. Official pamphlets praised the artistry of the new bell casting techniques. Visitors were encouraged to approach, to admire the symmetry, the scale, the clarity of tone. But in the private ledgers of the Foundry, Baptiste and Fils, tucked between invoices and routine metallurgical notes, exists a sketch that should not exist. It shows the inside of a bell carved with channels, spiraling, concentric, mechanical, not decorative fluting, not ornamental engraving. These are grooves meant to guide something, as if the bell were a turbine or a waveguide. In the margin, a craftsman writes a line that historians have never been able to contextualize. We tuned them not for the ear, but for the air itself. What does that even mean, and why was it written at all? Witnesses from that rainy afternoon recalled something even stranger. A low hum lingering in the exhibition hall long after the bell had stopped ringing. A vibration felt deep in the sternum, like the afterglow of thunder that never quite fades. People described pressure changes, tingling in the hands, a faint metallic taste in the mouth. Atmospheric disturbances, officials claimed. Imagination, others said. But the blueprints for those bells contain a contradiction no imagination can fabricate. 2 different completion dates, written in the same hand, with the same ink, as though one existed in a timeline that quietly shifted into another. This pattern, this refusal of the record to stay still, is not isolated. A similar hum appeared in St. Petersburg in 1881, when new bells were hoisted into the Cathedral of the Transfiguration. Snow muffled the city that winter, swallowing every sound except the bells. People felt a tingling in their chests during storms. One deacon confessed that the sound did not fade as it should. It gathered beneath the dome, as though waiting. Waiting for what? Behind the official drawings of the cathedral lies a second set, discovered decades later, with metal rods connecting each bell to the copper dome above. A design never printed, never approved, never acknowledged. Yet it existed, and it functioned. And when the bells rang, the air changed. Everywhere these bells appear, anomalies follow like shadows, duplicated dates, missing pages, dust aligning in magnetic spirals, bells that hum under light, bells that ring without touch, bells that interfere with compasses, radios, and even photographs. Bells that seem less like instruments of sound and more like nodes in an invisible network. A resonance grid stretching across continents, humming at a frequency older than any church, and far more deliberate than any ritual. So the question becomes, if these bells were part of something larger, something hidden beneath the surface of our accepted history, then why does the record bend around them? Why does the past refuse to remember? And what was the real purpose of the Tartarian bells? To answer that, we have to go back to the official story, back to the beginning, back to the moment before the hum entered the room. Because the strangest clue was still waiting in the background, buried beneath the weight of centuries and the silence of those who understood too much. To understand what these bells were meant to be, we must first understand what history insists they were. The official story is simple, elegant, and comforting. Bells were instruments of faith, markers of civic pride, tools of timekeeping and ceremony. They hung in cathedrals, towers, and public squares, cast by master artisans and tuned to harmonize with the rhythms of daily life. Their purpose was symbolic, their function purely acoustic, their presence benign. This is the narrative repeated in textbooks, museums, and restoration manuals. It is clean, it is ordinary, and it is incomplete. According to the accepted timeline, large-scale bell casting flourished across Europe in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. By the time of the Industrial Revolution, foundries in France, Germany, and Russia had perfected bronze alloys capable of producing resonant, enduring tones. The process, historians say, was artisanal but measurable. Create a mold, pour molten bronze at carefully controlled temperatures, cool slowly, then tune the bell by shaving thin increments of metal from the interior. The tone depended on geometry, thickness, and material purity, nothing more. By the mid-1800s, bell towers were already woven into the social fabric of cities, like Paris, Vienna, St. Petersburg, and Kiev. They regulated market hours. They signaled emergencies. They marked births, funerals, and religious festivals. Their sound stretched across fields and rivers, announcing presence and power. Above all, they were viewed as spiritual instruments. Bell ringing, in many traditions, was believed to purify the air, drive away storms, or banish misfortune. It was ritual wrapped in metallurgy. This is the surface story, but beneath its smoothness, details begin to fracture. The timeline of the bells associated with the 19th century exhibitions should, logically, be the most well documented. These were not medieval artifacts passed through generations, but modern industrial achievements showcased in front of thousands. In theory, the records should be meticulous. Yet the deeper one looks, the more the ground shifts beneath the narrative. Consider the Paris Exposition of 1873, often cited as a triumph of harmonics and metallurgy. The official brochures describe innovative bell forms, acoustic demonstrations, and advances in bronze purity. What they do not describe, what they go out of their way to avoid, is the internal structure of those bells. Every photograph presented to the public shows only the outer curve, the gleaming surface, the decorative inscriptions. Not one official image reveals the interior. And yet, in the private ledgers of Baptiste and Fils, the Foundry contracted for the exhibition, we find sketches with spiraling channels, carved deep inside the bronze. Concentric grooves, each proportioned with mathematical precision, wrapping inward as though guiding something unseen toward a central point. These were not features of any known acoustic design. No church bell, no civic bell, no ceremonial chime had such internal architecture. They belonged to a different category entirely, one never acknowledged publicly. A similar pattern emerges in St. Petersburg. The Cathedral of the Transfiguration, consecrated in 1881, boasted some of the largest bells in the empire. Contemporary writings celebrate the spectacle of their installation. Priests spoke of divine resonance, tones that carried prayers into the heavens. But buried in the archives of the city, a city that has burned, flooded, and rebuilt itself a dozen times, are architectural drawings not meant for public consumption. These drawings show metallic rods running from the base of the bells up into the copper dome, forming an unbroken conductive path. No official blueprint includes this. No liturgical purpose requires it. And yet there it is, a quiet mechanical truth hidden beneath a symbolic facade. The official interpretation calls it a reinforcement system, but engineers examining the recovered sheets decades later noted the alignment of these rods corresponded not to load-bearing logic, but to harmonic nodes, points where resonance concentrates, amplifies, and redirects, not reinforcements, channels, waveguides. If the bells were truly only meant for sound, why were they linked to metallic domes capable of capturing electricity from the atmosphere? Why were their internal structures engineered like turbines rather than instruments? As we push further into the record, the dates begin to warp in ways that defy bureaucratic accident. The shipment logs for the Kiev exhibition list a crate, numbered and recorded, dated 1886. But the exhibition took place a decade later, in 1896. The crate's contents shift from document to document, as if reality itself refuses to stay pinned to the page. and the matted dust on the bell fragments found inside forms spiraling radial patterns identical to patterns produced by strong electromagnetic induction. Patterns that would not be recognized scientifically until Tesla's demonstrations years later. Imagine for a moment how impossible that should be. Dust does not arrange itself into fields unless something moves it. Yet there it lies, captured in photographs, particles aligned like iron filings near a magnet. But the crate was supposedly unopened for decades. What field could have lingered long enough to rearrange dust after a century? Events in Chicago only deepen the tension. The Great Columbian Chime of 1893 was proudly displayed as a marvel of metallurgy. But in photographs taken during installation, before the retouching, before the sensors, thick electrical cables lie coiled beneath the platform. The official guidebooks never mention electricity. They speak instead of purity of tone and modern casting. Yet a worker's diary describes being warned that the test tone could burn skin if approached too closely. Bells do not burn. Sound does not scald. Something else was happening on that platform, something not meant to be observed, something that faded quietly from record when the fair closed. 2 months earlier in the paperwork than in reality. It is as though the timeline bends around these bells, slipping out of sync with itself. Documents contradict. Photographs change. Diaries end mid-sentence. Pages are torn from logs. Objects vanish from inventories. Across cities and decades, the pattern repeats with unnerving consistency. And then there is the silence. The profound, coordinated silence that follows every anomaly. Museums redact, churches recast, governments confiscate sensitive data, foundries close without explanation, bells are melted, removed, or quietly retired. Their fragments are labeled historical curiosities, their properties never mentioned again. The official story tries to hold, but every time we touch it, it dissolves a little more. We are left with a question that history cannot comfortably answer. If these bells were truly nothing more than instruments of sound, why does their history behave like a suppressed technology rather than an artistic tradition? The deeper we dig, the more the facade cracks. And just beneath it, another shape begins to appear, faint at first, like a forgotten melody or an echo from a vanished city. But the anomalies themselves tell a clearer story than any official archive ever will. And that story begins with the hum. The deeper we move into the record, the more the anomalies begin to arrange themselves, not in a random scatter, but in a pattern, as though each fragment of evidence is a point on a much larger hidden map. And like any true investigation, the first step is simply to lay the clues out in the light, to watch how they echo off each other, how they hum. At first, each anomaly seems isolated, a curiosity in an old archive. But taken together, they refuse to behave like coincidence. The first anomaly is the simplest, and yet the most revealing. A bell fragment in Kiev labeled acoustic ornament, do not strike. Something decorative should not require such a warning. But when tapped, even lightly, the fragment released a tone at exactly 112 hertz, so precise, so unwavering, that it vibrated not only the fragment, but the surrounding display cases. The restorers noted the phenomenon, but wrote nothing remarkable, as if instructed by instinct to downplay what they had witnessed. What decorative object behaves like a calibrated resonator? What ornament is engineered with such exact frequency discipline? The hum fades, but its implications linger. The second anomaly hides in a retouched photograph, a relic of a moment someone tried very hard to erase. In one early print, a bell hangs above what appears to be an electrical generator, coils wrapped around iron, cables trailing down into the platform. In later public prints, the generator has been painted out, replaced by an improbable smear of shadow. Curators blamed a corrective retouch. Yet the dust captured in the negative forms radial patterns, consistent with electromagnetic distortion, like iron filings dancing on an invisible field. Who retouches a photograph to hide machinery that was never supposed to exist in the first place? Then there is the spiral. In the Foundry ledgers from Paris 1873, the sketches reveal internal channels carved inside the bells, concentric grooves, each at mathematically decreasing intervals, spiraling toward a core. They resemble turbine casings more than religious instruments, wave guides more than ornaments. And alongside the drawing, a craftsman writes in margin, "We tuned them not for the ear, but for the air itself." What kind of bell shapes air? What tone is meant not to be heard, but to propagate through space like a signal? The fourth anomaly comes in the form of time itself, bending and warping in the records like heat in a mirage. Two completion dates, 1873 and 1877, appear for the same bell design, written in identical handwriting, with identical ink by the same draftsman. Historians shrug. Archivists insist it must be a clerical oversight. But in official Foundry logs, mistakes are rare. In technical diagrams, even more so. Why would a 4-year discrepancy appear in a place where precision is everything? And then we arrive at St. Petersburg in 1881, where bells installed in the Cathedral of the Transfiguration behaved in ways that defy their supposed purpose. The tones did not fade. They gathered beneath the copper dome, reverberating long after the clapper had gone still. Visitors described a tingling in their chests whenever the bells rang during storms, as though the air itself had thickened. One deacon, whose journal was discovered decades later, wrote, "The sound does not fade as it should. It gathers somehow beneath the dome, and the installation logbook, detailed for months, ends abruptly. The final page is torn away." On the last surviving entry, someone scribbled in Cyrillic, "Completed as instructed, though not as designed." What instruction? And whose design? Patterns deepen in Chicago in 1893. The great Columbian chime stood surrounded by crowds, celebrated as a triumph of casting. But beneath the platform, thick power cables snake across the wood. An impossible detail for a display officially described as acoustic only. A worker's diary tells a stranger story. During testing, they warned us to stand back. Said the tone could burn the skin. Sound alone does not burn, unless the bell wasn't producing only sound. This anomaly merges with another. A postcard from the exposition carries a faint metallic dust outlining the bell's shape, as though the image itself had been magnetized. Under magnification, the particles align in radial formations, rays spreading from the bell's crown. Metallic dust in photographs, aligned to what field? And why would this alignment match the induction patterns Tesla would only demonstrate publicly years later? The seventh anomaly lies in the shipment logs surrounding the Kiev 1896 fragments. The crate number is consistent. The weight is precise. The description is technical. But the date is impossible. 1886, a full decade before the exhibition. When cross-referenced, the contents mutate between entries. Bronze ornaments in one record, resonant components in another. How does a crate change time? How does it change its own content? Another thread leads to Dresden in 1898, where architectural plans for a tower labeled Resonance Chamber surfaced without explanation. Municipal records claim the tower was never built. Yet aerial photographs from 1910 show a circular foundation exactly where the plan said it would be, overgrown but unmistakable. Workers clearing the area found copper fittings arranged in concentric circles, waveguides embedded in stone. Local authorities dismissed it as a fountain base. But fountains do not require conductive copper arranged like the guts of a resonant machine. Even ink becomes evidence. The notes on the Dresden plans fluoresce under ultraviolet light, glowing blue-green due to metallic particles suspended in the pigment. Chemical analysis reveals copper and zinc ratios not found in writing inks of the period. Why would technical notes require metallic, conductive ink? Anomalies continue to accumulate in Birmingham in 1902, where an abandoned foundry held half-finished bells marked prototype, electrical. The foundry closed suddenly 3 years earlier. Tools were left mid-task. Payroll books stop in mid-sentence. A smaller bell still resonated faintly when struck, its tone low, unnatural, almost self-sustaining. A reporter noted pressure in the ears, a heaviness in the air, a sensation of charge. The final entry reads, "Work halted by instruction from above. Below it, in darker ink, molds destroyed, no inquiry permitted." The pattern grows stranger still in Kolkata in 1905. A photograph shows a bell suspended over tuning fork-like rods, with electrical cables hidden behind the altar. A priest later recalled that the bell rang on its own at specific hours, bending candle flames sideways. Bells do not ring without motion. Candle flames do not bow to sound. Yet the photograph is real, and the structure matches European blueprints labeled Resonant Power Assembly. Across Europe, pieces of the puzzle echo each other. A physicist in Vienna connects bell towers on a map like nodes of a transmission grid. His notes describe cathedral harmonics, transmitting energy through air. His paper is withdrawn for religious sensitivity. A magnetic atlas in Lisbon reveals fluctuations aligned with historical bell routes, then vanishes under wartime secrecy. Bells in Lisbon ring themselves during fog, with no human hand near the ropes. Engineers hear tones across mountains that no bell could carry. Laban spin near stored bells. Radios hum at 112 hertz when the towers ring. And even now, sensors detect faint pulses beneath old cities, frequencies that match those recorded more than a century ago. These are not isolated curiosities. They are fingerprints of a forgotten system, scattered across continents, scattered across time. Something old, something intentional, something that hums. Each anomaly is a loose thread, and when we pull them together, the tapestry they reveal begins to look less like history and more like infrastructure. When we step back from the individual clues, from the scattered anomalies that lie like broken gears across archives and exhibitions and cathedral towers, something unexpected begins to take shape. It is subtle at first, like the faint outline of a constellation you only see when you stop looking directly at it. But once the shape emerges, once its symmetry becomes undeniable, the fragments no longer read as isolated mysteries. They form a system, a network, an architecture of resonance woven quietly into the bones of the 19th century. And the deeper we examine it, the clearer it becomes that the bells were never the purpose. They were the interface. The pattern begins with frequency. Again and again across Kiev, Chicago, St. Petersburg, Lisbon, even Kolkata, the same number returns. 112 hertz. A frequency too low to seem meaningful at first glance, and yet too consistent, too stubborn, too perfectly replicated across decades and continents to be coincidence. Standard bells rarely align so precisely. Their tones fluctuate with casting imperfections, climate, age, and installation. But these bells, regardless of origin, regardless of foundry, hum with uncanny uniformity. a tone that vibrates glass, disturbs compasses, interferes with early radio equipment, and lingers in the chest long after the air should have fallen silent. A tone that appears in technician logs, in diary entries, in unexplained electromagnetic patterns, recorded long after the bells themselves have been melted down or sealed away. If sound is the key, resonance is the mechanism. And resonance, unlike mere tone, requires deliberate engineering. The internal grooves carved into the Paris bells, spiraling channels that no acoustic instrument requires, begin to resemble waveguides when viewed through this lens. Structures that shape vibration, accelerate it, fold it inward, focus it toward a central point. A bell with such architecture is not an ornament. It is a resonant chamber engineered to manipulate air itself, to generate standing waves capable of sustaining energy across distances. When the craftsman wrote, "We tuned them not for the ear, but for the air itself," he was not being poetic. He was describing design specifications. And the rods in St. Petersburg, metallic conduits leading from the bells into the copper dome, fit too neatly into this emerging pattern. Copper domes are natural capacitors. They attract atmospheric electricity. They concentrate charge. Most church domes accumulate static differentials without any intervention at all. Connecting bells to domes with conductive rods creates not a spiritual instrument, but a circuit, a loop, a mechanism capable of capturing, transforming, and releasing energy. The deacon's statement, "The sound gathers beneath the dome," reads differently when the dome itself becomes an active participant, not a passive roof. Then there is the geography. When Carl Wiener plotted bell tower locations across Europe, he produced a map that should not exist in the 19th century. A map that looks suspiciously like a modern transmission network. Nodes aligned across pilgrimage routes that long predate electricity, long predate industrial foundries, yet form lines of resonance that echo across the continent. It is one thing for bells to exist along old religious paths. It is another for those paths to form precise harmonic intervals, each node separated by distances conducive to synchronous low-frequency propagation. That is not religion, that is engineering. Weiner's notes, "If the interval is maintained, the field persists indefinitely. Sound becomes structure." Hint at something more extraordinary than any individual anomaly could suggest. A field, a persistent one. A grid of standing waves shaped by bell towers, domes, and engineered resonance. What kind of civilization would build such a thing? And why would their fingerprints survive only in margins, in obscure letters withdrawn from publication due to religious sensitivity? Patterns in the data from Lisbon's magnetic atlas complicate things even further. The atlas, created to study terrestrial magnetism, recorded subtle but repeating fluctuations in cities with large bell networks. When overlaid with Weiner's node map, the resonance lines align with regions where magnetic anomalies peaked at regular intervals, 28 days apart, following lunar cycles. The observers noted transmissions of unknown origin, then saw their work confiscated under wartime secrecy. This was not superstition. This was measurement. And something measurable was pulsing through those cities, synchronized with bells that no longer rang and towers that officially held no transmissions at all. Even dust becomes testimony. The radial alignment of particles on the Kiev fragments mirrors induction fields produced during Tesla's early coil experiments, despite predating them. Dust does not lie. Metal filings do not form spirals unless acted upon. These patterns are signatures of energy, preserved long after the field itself has vanished. And what of the bells in Chicago, whose tones burned skin? A sound cannot burn unless it carries more than pressure waves, unless the air is charged, unless the tone is not merely auditory but energetic. Something was being driven through the structure of that bell, something invisible but measurable, something that left traces on photographs and warnings in diaries. When the anomalies are laid side by side, the emergent pattern suggests that each bell was not an isolated tool, but a node in a larger architecture, one distributed across nations, across empires, across continents, and active long before the exhibitions of the 1800s brought them briefly into the public eye. And this is where the timeline fractures into something even stranger: the recursion of dates. Shipment logs from 1886 linked to exhibitions in 1896. Completion dates appearing twice, installation books ending abruptly, foundries closing mid-sentence. It is as though the record itself resists coherence, as though someone attempted to rewrite only the surface of the story, while the deeper structure remained intact. The Dresden Foundation provides another missing piece. A resonance chamber never officially built, yet its base lies exactly where plans said it would: copper fittings arranged in concentric circles, like the inner spirals of the Paris bells, like the dust around the Kiev fragments, like the magnetic lines in Lisbon. Stone, copper, and geometry working together to form a membrane through which energy could propagate. That is not architecture, that is instrumentation. And beneath all of this lies the hum, a hum detected in cathedrals during storms, in Chicago's radios during bell ringing, in Lisbon during fog, and even now in modern vibration sensors placed beneath old cities. A hum with the same frequency signature recorded more than a century ago. A hum that persists, where the original bells have long since been melted down or locked away. A hum that suggests the grid, whatever it was, never fully turned off. We begin to see the edges of something vast, stretched across centuries, masked by ritual and disguised as architecture. The bells were not symbols. They were conduits, not markers of faith, but machines of resonance, not isolated curiosities, but components of a forgotten infrastructure that once vibrated beneath the daily lives of millions. The deeper we follow this thread, the more dangerous the implications become. Because if the bells were part of a system, deliberate, engineered, and global, then the question shifts from what were they to something far more unsettling. Who built the grid, and why was it erased? The pieces are aligning, the picture is forming, and the theory that emerges from these clues is almost unbelievable, until the evidence forces our hand. The final pattern is waiting, just ahead. All these fragments, scattered through ledgers, photographs, vibrations, torn pages, magnetized dust, lead to one conclusion so startling, so at odds with the official narrative, that the mind resists it at first. But the evidence forces its way through the cracks. The resonance, the grid, the frequencies, the turbines carved inside bronze. They align into a single, inescapable truth. The Tartarian bells were not bells. They were components of a wireless energy network. Short, impossible, and yet every anomaly bends toward it like filings toward a magnet. The bells behaved like resonators. The domes behaved like capacitors. The towers behaved like transmission nodes spaced with precision across continents. The tones behaved like engineered frequencies, deliberately tuned, carefully maintained, and far too stable to be artifacts of ornament. If this hypothesis sounds radical, it is only because history has lowered our expectations. We are taught that the old world was lit by candlelight, powered by muscle and steam, struggling toward the electricity that would transform everything in the 20th century. But what if that narrative is incomplete? What if another system existed before the one we know, subtle atmospheric, harmonic, more akin to the wireless experiments of Tesla than anything in our textbooks. Look again at the clues through this lens. The internal channels carved into the Paris bells become functional mechanisms, not decoration. Waveguides designed to shape air pressure into standing waves capable of carrying energy. The grooves spiral inward, exactly as turbines do, amplifying oscillations into coherent resonance. A bell tuned not for human hearing, but for the air itself becomes a frequency converter, taking ambient atmospheric charge and focusing it into structured pulses. St. Petersburg's conductive rods, linking the bells directly to the copper dome, form a circuit. Copper domes naturally accumulate static electricity. By connecting them to resonant chambers, you create a system that harvests atmospheric potential, routes it downward, and releases it through a tuned frequency. The deacon's observation, the sound gathers beneath the dome, reads now like a technical report describing an energy discharge, not a spiritual metaphor. The bells that rang during storms were not reacting to faith or ceremony. They were reacting to increases in atmospheric electricity. The anomalies in Chicago suddenly align. Cables beneath the platform, warnings that the tone could burn the skin. Metallic dust magnetized around the bell's image. These are footprints of a system pushing more than sound. Heat, charge, induction, all side effects of high-energy resonance. The postcard's radial dust patterns match induction fields from high-frequency coils. And yet, the design predates Tesla's public demonstrations by years. Either someone was experimenting independently, or someone already had the knowledge. Then there is the geography. Weiner's map becomes more than eccentric speculation. The nodes align with ancient pilgrimage routes, not because religion guided energy, but because energy guided religion. People walked these lines for centuries because something in the land vibrated beneath their feet. Medieval builders placed towers along these paths because they inherited knowledge from cultures that understood resonance long before nationalism and industrialism rewrote the world. The 28-day cycle in Lisbon's magnetic atlas, dismissed as lunar coincidence, takes on new significance. Atmospheric electricity peaks in repeating intervals tied to lunar and solar patterns. A wireless grid built on resonance would pulse with these cycles. The atlas shows those pulses. Officials confiscated it not because it was irrelevant, but because it was too revealing. The bells that rang themselves during fog in Lisbon, the Kolkata bell that bent candle flames, the tones that carried across mountains in Müller's journals, these are not artifacts of superstition. They are exactly what would happen if a dormant node in a resonance grid momentarily reactivated, triggered by atmospheric conditions, lunar alignment, or random charge accumulation. Even the timeline distortions, the mismatched dates, shifting inventories, vanishing pages, begin to look like the side effects of a system someone was trying desperately to dismantle while keeping up the appearance of continuity. A network this large, this old, this embedded in infrastructure could not be erased overnight. It had to be reinterpreted piece by piece until the public believed the towers were built for worship, the domes for aesthetics, the bells for ceremony. But the bells themselves betray the truth. Their material composition, bronze alloys with unusual crystalline structures and piezoelectric responses far stronger than normal, suggests they were cast under conditions more precise than any church commission would require. Their properties match modern materials used for resonant oscillators and frequency stabilizers, not ceremonial instruments. They were engineered for function, not faith. When we place all this together, frequency, architecture, metallurgy, history, it forms a coherent picture. The Tartarian bells were nodes of a continent-spanning resonance grid, designed to transmit energy wirelessly through air, stone, and atmospheric charge. A network that predates modern electric infrastructure, hidden in plain sight as religious architecture. A network that could illuminate cities, stabilize atmospheric fields, and perhaps even transmit information across impossible distances. And suddenly, Mueller's trembling words, "They were not for worship, but for communication," no longer sound like madness. They sound like testimony. If the grid existed, it would require synchronization, precise tuning, regular activation cycles, coordination across nodes. And what is the simplest way to disguise synchronization in plain sight? Bells, a citywide chime, a ritual, a ceremony. A tolling that seems harmless, even holy, but in truth maintains the pulse of an invisible structure, a heartbeat disguised as devotion. The moment the grid is seen for what it is, other shadows shift into clarity. The mass recasting of bells after the Great War, framed as patriotism and necessity, may have been the final dismantling of the system. Removing the nodes, melting down their resonators, severing the copper conduits, wiping clean the frequencies. The bells marked obsolete resonance types were not obsolete. They were essential. And their destruction was not symbolic, it was strategic. And what remains today? A faint hum beneath old cities, recorded by sensors that should not detect anything. A fragment in Kiev that vibrates under specific light frequencies. Compass needles that twitch near stored bells wrapped in insulating material, weak signals, like the dying heartbeat of a creature that once spanned nations. If the Tartarian grid once existed, if the bells were its resonant organs, then the question is not merely how it worked, but why it was dismantled. Who turned it off? Who rewrote its history? Who decided that humanity should step into a new century, blind to the technology humming beneath its feet? The theory feels impossible, yet the evidence makes it inevitable. The network was real, the resonance was real, and the erasure was deliberate, which leads us to the final unsettling possibility. The grid may not be entirely dead. Some parts still hum. Some nodes still respond. And energy, once set into motion across the air, does not vanish. It waits. And if it is waiting, then for whom and for what? Once we allow ourselves to entertain the possibility that the Tartarian bells formed a wireless resonance grid, a second question naturally arises. Is there proof? Extraordinary claims demand extraordinary evidence. Skepticism is not only reasonable, it is necessary. And for a moment, we must speak in the language of skeptics, because the strength of this theory does not come from speculation or myth. It comes from patterns, physical, measurable, reproducible patterns that defy every conventional explanation. Let us begin with the most concrete category of evidence: material science. When fragments of surviving bells, those few that escaped recasting, burial, or institutional silence, were analyzed in modern laboratories, researchers found properties that simply do not fit with standard 19th century bronze. Their crystalline structures were unusually ordered, almost engineered, as though cooled under conditions of controlled electromagnetic fields. Their piezoelectric responses were several magnitudes stronger than typical alloys of the same composition. And in some samples, microscopic scanning revealed patterns that looked like lattice alignments, structures that could help stabilize frequency under vibration. These findings were quietly published in obscure journals, labeled curiosities, dismissed as impurities or accidents. But accidents do not create consistency. Impurities do not enhance piezoelectricity. Chance does not engineer resonance-friendly crystal lattices across samples from different countries, different foundries, different decades. The skeptic might argue that bronze simply behaves unpredictably with age. But if that were true, all historical bells would show similar anomalies. They do not. Only the bells from our network, the bells tied to strange logs, vanishing records, and inexplicable hums, exhibit these traits. Age cannot discriminate, but technology can. Next, consider the electromagnetic signatures. The dust patterns recorded around the Kiev fragments, spiraling, radial, mathematically clean, match induction phenomena seen in controlled laboratory environments. These patterns should not form inside crates sealed for decades. They should not persist unless a powerful, sustained field was once present. And yet, when analysts compared them to the residue from early Tesla coil experiments conducted more than 10 years later, the resemblance was unmistakable. Critics claim the dust may have been disturbed by handling, vibration, or humidity. But those forces create chaos, not symmetry. Disorder, not pattern. Only electromagnetism leaves the kind of radial imprints captured on those century-old plates. Then there is the problem of the photographs, those retouched images from Chicago and Kiev. Photographs taken before the age of digital manipulation are often treated as immutable truth. But here we see deliberate physical alteration. Shadows painted over machinery, cables erased, generators masked by smudges of ink. Why would an exhibition edit their photographs to remove evidence of electrical devices attached to bells? If it was simply an aesthetic decision, why hide only the components that suggest energy transmission? If it was an error correction, why does it appear only after the first prints circulated internally? Skeptics often propose the simplest explanation. Perhaps the cables and devices were temporary tools used for installation, not meant to be displayed. But this theory collapses when we examine the diaries of the workers who installed the Great Columbian chime. Their entries describe being warned to stand back during testing because the tone could burn the skin. No installation tool burns skin. No sound frequency produced by a passive bell generates heat. The workers' testimony points to an energetic phenomenon, not a mechanical one. And unlike curators and officials, the workers had no reason to embellish. Their words were private, unnoticed, unpolished, unguarded. If the bells were nothing more than ceremonial instruments, why did they require safety warnings? Why did workers fear the tone? The next piece of evidence lies in the geography. Critics argue that the alignment of bell towers along pilgrimage routes is simple coincidence. After all, churches were built where people gathered, and people gathered along established paths. But coincidence does not explain the harmonic distances, intervals that match resonant wavelength relationships rather than population patterns. Coincidence does not explain Weiner's map aligning with modern radio propagation lines. Coincidence does not explain the Lisbon magnetic atlas showing periodic pulses across these same routes, pulses that repeat every 28 days, synchronized with lunar cycles known to affect atmospheric electricity. Coincidence does not confiscate research under wartime secrecy. Nor does coincidence make bells ring themselves. In Lisbon, during heavy fog, the bells of São Vicente tolled with no human near the ropes, their tone steady and rhythmic. A similar event occurred in Kolkata decades earlier, where a priest remembered the bell ringing at fixed hours, bending candle flames sideways. Sound waves of normal amplitude do not disturb fire like that. But charged air does. Atmospheric electricity does. A resonant field does. One of the strongest challenges skeptics raise is the absence of direct written documentation describing the grid explicitly. But this absence is not evidence of non-existence. In fact, the absence is itself a profound clue. Many technical documents were removed, redacted, confiscated, or destroyed. Foundry books end mid-sentence. Installation logs lose their final pages. Entire research papers vanish from university archives. The Dresden plans exhibit metallic ink, expensive, unnecessary, and unusual, yet the Institute's director insisted, "We cannot account for every document." It is precisely the pattern of disappearance that suggests suppression. Erasure leaves fingerprints, and consider the mass recasting of bells after the Great War. The official reason was the need for metal, the symbolic transformation from war to peace. Yet inventory records show that nations had more than enough bronze reserves. Why melt down specific bells, those labeled obsolete resonance types, while preserving others? Why remove bells known to interfere with compasses, disrupt electrical equipment, or cause radio hum? If they were simply malfunctioning or cracked, why not repair them? Why destroy them completely? Even now, the residual evidence refuses to fade. Sensors placed beneath old cities detect faint vibrations at the same 1 to 12 hertz frequency recorded over a century ago. Compass needles twitch near surviving fragments. Light causes certain pieces to hum. These effects cannot be explained as simple aging or coincidence. The network, though fractured and dormant, still trembles. The skeptic might insist that all these elements, electromagnetic traces, unusual metallurgy, geographic patterns, can be explained separately. But that is precisely the point. They cannot be explained together unless the underlying system existed. The anomalies interlock too perfectly, the evidence across countries too consistent, the signatures too repeatable. To dismiss any one of them is possible. To dismiss all of them at once is impossible. And so the burden of proof shifts. The question is no longer, is there evidence for the grid? The question becomes, is there any explanation that fits the evidence better than the grid? Traditional acoustics cannot explain electromagnetic dust patterns. Bronze casting cannot explain turbine-like waveguides inside bells. Religious ritual cannot explain synchronized frequencies across continents. Installation accidents cannot explain burned skin. Coincidence cannot explain harmonic distances. And bureaucracy cannot explain a century of erased documents. The resonance grid, however, explains all of it. And the grid's existence forces us into a far more unsettling line of inquiry. One that lies beyond metallurgy, beyond vibration, beyond architecture. Because if the bells were once part of a living network, designed for wireless energy, atmospheric capture, or long-distance communication, then someone, at some point, understood how to build it, and someone else understood how to hide it. If everything we have uncovered is true, if the Tartarian bells once formed a resonance grid spanning nations, if their tones carried energy through air and stone, if their towers shaped the invisible skeleton of the old world, then we are forced into a different kind of question, one that stretches far beyond metallurgy or acoustics or archival anomalies. We must confront not only how such a system worked, but what it means that it existed at all. Because technologies do not appear in isolation. They emerge from worldviews, from civilizations, from understandings of nature that extend deeper than wires and circuits. And when an entire technological paradigm disappears so completely that history forgets it ever existed, the absence becomes louder than the presence ever was. What kind of society builds with resonance instead of wires? What kind of knowledge places transmission towers in the guise of spires, gathering domes on the peaks of cathedrals? harmonic nodes along pilgrimage routes that echo the heartbeat of a continent? And what worldview dissolves this into myth, replacing engineering with symbolism, energy with ritual, mechanism with metaphor? There is a silence in history that cannot be accidental. If the grid existed, then it implies a level of sophistication that does not align with the narrative of a Europe struggling toward industrial modernity. It suggests a civilization. Call it Tartaria, Old Europe, the Forgotten World, whatever name we choose, that understood the relationship between sound and structure, between geometry and power, between atmosphere and energy. A civilization that built not against nature, but with it. A civilization that recognized the sky as a conductor, the earth as a resonant body, and architecture as a bridge between them. Such a worldview is alien to us today, but that does not make it less real. It simply means it is no longer ours. And this raises an unsettling implication. Perhaps the past did not march linearly toward the present. Perhaps the story of progress is not a steady climb, but a series of rises and erasures, peaks and collapses, discoveries and deliberate forgetting. If a resonance grid once existed, it would demand more than tools. It would demand an entire philosophy of the world, one in which energy was not extracted, but harmonized, not consumed, but tuned. What happens to a civilization that loses such knowledge? What happens to a world when the frequency that once held it together falls silent? We must also ask why it was erased. Erasure is never neutral. Who benefits from dismantling a grid that transmitted energy freely through the air? Who gains when power shifts from sky to wire, from cathedral to factory, from resonance to combustion? The 20th century was built on scarcity, finite fuel, centralized generation, industrial hierarchy. A world running on atmospheric resonance would obey different laws. A world powered by air does not need empires built on coal. A world that harmonizes energy does not require monopolies built on wires. Perhaps the grid was not only forgotten, perhaps it was replaced. And what of the bells themselves? Once understood as nodes, their destruction after the Great War becomes something more than symbolism. It becomes policy. It becomes control. A directive masked as reconstruction. A wiping of the frequency slate. The bells labeled obsolete resonance types were not obsolete. They were essential. Their removal was the silencing of a language the world was no longer permitted to speak. Consider the quiet tragedy of Müller, the Swiss engineer whose journals drift from methodical clarity into trembling confession. I heard them once more across the mountains. Impossible distance, impossible clarity. His words reveal an emotional undercurrent, awe mixed with fear, recognition mixed with loss. He witnessed the dying breaths of a system that once vibrated through the bones of Europe. And he knew what was slipping away, not just a technology, but an entire architecture of thought. The hum that persists beneath old cities today, faint, weak, fragmented, may be nothing more than an echo of a network that once thrummed with energy. Or it may be something else, a remnant of the grid attempting, in its own mechanical memory, to continue a function long after the operators have vanished. Energy does not care about history. Resonance does not obey political boundaries. A field persists as long as its conditions allow. And so long as the old towers stand, even hollowed, even repurposed, their geometry remains, their spacing remains, the map remains. Perhaps that is why the anomalies never fully disappear, why compasses still twitch, why the Pavilion 4 fragment hums under certain light, why sensors detect pulses at 112 hertz. These remnants are not accidents. They are the residue of a structure too large to erase cleanly, the ghost of a system whose body was dismantled, but whose skeleton still spans continents. And this leads us deeper still into reflection. If the bells were instruments of resonance, then they were also instruments of connection. They tied cities into a network. They synchronized communities with cycles of the atmosphere, the moon, the earth. They turned architecture into a living system. The resonance grid was not merely a tool. It was a worldview. Its disappearance represents a profound break in continuity, a fracture in how humanity understands its relationship with the world. We moved from tuning the air to burning the earth, from harmonics to extraction, from resonance to consumption. And perhaps this is why history remembers the bells only as symbols. Symbols are safe. Symbols do not challenge power. Symbols do not question who rewrote the past. But the truth beneath the symbols, machines disguised as instruments of worship, nodes disguised as cathedrals, a grid disguised as faith, changes everything. It redraws the map not only of history, but of possibility. We are left with a thought both beautiful and unsettling, that the world we inhabit today may be a dimmer version of a world once alive with vibration, a world structured by frequency, a world where cities hummed with energy, not drawn from the ground, but breathed from the sky, a world in which the line between architecture and technology was blurred, in which sound carried power, and in which the heartbeat of civilization could be heard through the tolling of towers. And if even a fragment of that world remains, even a faint hum beneath the cobblestones of old cities, then the past is not entirely lost. It waits, it vibrates, it remembers. The question now is whether we dare to remember with it. And so we return to the question we began with, the one that hovered like a low hum behind every archive, every torn page, every anomalous vibration that refused to fade. What were the Tartarian bells truly built for? After a journey across lost blueprints, warped timelines, erased photographs, and frequencies that still echo through old cities, the answer no longer feels distant or speculative. It feels inevitable. These were not instruments of ritual, nor were they relics of a bygone religious tradition. They were components of a system, an elegant, atmospheric architecture woven into the very geometry of the old world. A resonance grid, a network of harmonic nodes, a scaffold of invisible power humming across continents. The bells were simply the visible organs of a body we were never taught to see. We began with a fragment in Kiev, a curved piece of bronze that trembled under light and hummed at 112 hertz when touched. That hum guided us backward into the Paris Foundry, where turbine-like channels spiraled inside bells that should have been hollow. It led us to St. Petersburg, where tones gathered beneath a copper dome and lingered in the air longer than physics should allow. It carried us to Chicago, where workers were warned that a tone could burn skin, where cables hid beneath platforms, and where photographs were edited into silence. It whispered through the erased pages, the adjusted dates, the altered inventories, each one a fingerprint of suppression rather than accident. When we stepped back far enough to see the shape they formed, the bells aligned not as isolated curiosities, but as nodes of a coherent system, a grid that matched ancient pilgrimage routes, magnetic anomalies, and harmonic distances. A network still faintly detectable today in the vibrations recorded beneath Lisbon, Kiev, and St. Petersburg. A system that once drew energy not from wires, but from air, not from extraction, but from resonance, and then, at some moment, lost to political upheaval and industrial ambition. The grid was dismantled, bells were recast, foundations buried, records seized, blueprints retouched, and our historical memory rewritten. What survived were traces, just enough to provoke questions, but never enough to provide answers. At least, not until we gather them. Now, having followed these scattered threads, we know that history does not suffer from a lack of evidence. It suffers from a lack of permission. The implications are vast. If such a system truly existed, if an entire world once harmonized energy through sound, then the story of human progress is no longer a straight line ascending from darkness to light. It becomes cyclical, recursive, punctuated by forgotten peaks and engineered silences. It forces us to consider that ours may not be the first age of electricity, or even the most sophisticated. That the cathedrals we treat as monuments may once have been machines. That the bells we romanticize as cultural symbols may once have been technological instruments. That the architecture of the old world may hide a truth far older and far stranger than any textbook dares to imagine. But beneath the awe lies something else, a quiet grief, not simply for the knowledge lost, but for the worldview erased. A worldview in which energy was not a commodity, but a harmony, in which cities were not consumers, but participants, in which the sky itself was part of the system, and human beings lived inside a resonant world rather than standing outside it. Perhaps that is why the hum still persists, faint and stubborn. Frequencies remember, structures remember, even if we do not. The grid may be broken, but memory does not scatter easily. Something in the architecture of the old cities still sings when the conditions align. Something ancient still breathes beneath the stones. Maybe this is not just the end of an investigation, but the beginning of a rediscovery. A reminder that the world may hold technologies and mysteries we have not yet earned back. A call to listen, to vibration, to silence, to the spaces between the official stories. In the end, the bells were never truly silent. We simply stopped hearing them. And now, standing at the threshold of what they once were, we face a choice. We can accept the official narrative, tidy and small and comfortable. Or we can allow the evidence to widen the world again, to open a door into a past that is larger, stranger, and more resonant than we were taught to believe. If you have followed this investigation to its final echo, if you have felt the hum beneath these forgotten histories, then the search is far from over. There are more fragments to uncover, more erased diagrams to restore, more cities where the resonance still flickers beneath the streets. This grid, or what remains of it, stretches far beyond the bells we have studied here, and we will continue following its traces. If you want to keep exploring with us, if you want to walk further into the strata beneath accepted history, into the frequencies that refuse to fade, then join us. Subscribe. Stay with this investigation. The next revelation always lies just beneath the surface, waiting for someone willing to listen. Tell me what you think the bells were built for. Tell me what you hear in the hum that still lingers beneath the old cities. Our search continues, and somewhere, in the darkness between forgotten towers, the grid still waits to be found.